very German thing. Okay, danke schön. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich kann ein bisschen Deutsch sprechen, aber nicht zu viel und sehr langsam. Also ich werde auf Englisch sprechen. But I will try to make it my best and clearest English. I'm going to talk about this idea of Media 2.0. The claim that we're living through a revolution in the media environment. And as we know, that revolution is talked about in terms of media culture, but also in terms of education. People are arguing that the coming of new media will call for new paradigms, new approaches, new methods of learning, new approaches to teaching, new institutions of education. What I'm going to do, though, is to focus particularly on media education, that is, teaching about media. How will we teach about media in this new world that people are talking about? So, what I'll do is, first of all, to give you a bit of a sense of the context of media education and teaching about media in the UK. I'll then talk about this 2.0 debate. In the UK, there's still a debate going on about this issue and some quite heated confrontations and discussions about the implications of new media for media education. I want to give quite a critical view, as I say here, of this. I'm not intending to completely dismiss the idea that there is a revolution happening, but I think a lot of the claims that are made about this are exaggerated, overstated. So I'm going to talk a bit about this idea of Media 2.0, then I'll talk about some implications for education. Hopefully I will have time to talk about 3 specific research projects I've been involved in, really action research projects, and I'll come to a conclusion, hopefully in about 1 hour's time. But if I go on too long, don't just leave and just leave me here and talk. I'm very well known for talking for a very long time. Okay, so I think I need to say a bit about the context in the UK, because we have a long history of teaching about media in schools. I can look back, I think, something like 80 years to the first publications about media teaching in schools. And from the 1930s through the 1960s, 1970s, increasingly there are proposals but also practical experiences of media teaching happening in schools. I've written about this history in terms of a tension, really, between, on the one hand, a very defensive approach towards media, and on the other hand, a kind of democratisation. So on the one hand, you have the idea that the school curriculum needs to become more responsive to young people's cultures, that the school needs to be more relevant to what young people are doing outside school, and that, of course, includes their experience of media. So on the one hand, a sense that the school curriculum needs to be democratised, but on the other hand, right through this history, and I think internationally as well, when people talk about teaching media, they're very often talking about a kind of defensiveness or a need to protect children from what are seen to be harmful influences. I think in the UK, that emphasis has been very much about a kind of cultural defensiveness. It's been about the idea that the media are bad culture, the media are trashy, American, low culture. And if we teach about media, what we're trying to do is to move children on to appreciate high culture, great literature, great art. But that defensiveness has other emphases in different contexts. One could also say that there is a kind of moral defensiveness. Very often when people talk about teaching media, their aim is to prevent children from getting involved in various kinds of morally unacceptable behaviour. So we teach about media to stop children getting involved in violence or premature sex or drugs or anything else. That approach is very common in the United States, I think. This idea that somehow it's the media that are responsible for all these bad things that young people learn to do, and if we teach them to be critical of media, they will stop doing those bad things. We have another kind of defensiveness in our history as well, what I would call a kind of political defensiveness. And here, I think the logic in some ways is the same. The media are the source of lots of bad ideas, and if we teach children to be critical of media, somehow we'll liberate them from those bad ideas. So within the history, we have this tension between, on the one hand, a democratising, an opening of the school to make it more relevant to children's culture, but on the other hand, this defensive, protectionist approach. I would say that historically in the UK and in other countries where media education has developed, there's really been a move away from that sort of defensive, protectionist approach. So today, when people talk about the aim of teaching about media, it's really to promote understanding, to promote also participation in media culture. It's not really about saving children, rescuing children from a harmful influence. The media curriculum in the UK is organised in terms of key concepts. So typically what we find are 4 key concepts that are used to structure the curriculum. So we're teaching about media language, so how do the media construct, communicate meaning. We're teaching about representation, how do media represent, portray the world. Media institutions, so the industries, the organisations that produce and regulate media, and media audiences. How do media target audiences? How do audiences respond? So those concepts really structure the teaching of media in the UK. Important though to say that this is not just about critical analysis. It's about reading, but also about writing media. So if we look at what people do in media education, it's not just about doing critical analysis. It's also about getting kids using cameras, making websites, creating media. And very often, what teachers are trying to achieve is a dynamic, a dialectic between creativity and critique. Most recently, we've tended to talk about this in terms of 3 C's: creativity, culture, and critique, if that means anything. A bit of a slogan, I think. So where does it happen? Well, in most schools in the UK, it is possible for children to study a specialist course in media from the age of 14 up. So in school years 10, 11, and then 12 and 13, the top end of secondary school. In most cases, you can follow a specialised optional course. But it's also there as a dimension of mother tongue language teaching, in our case, English. So in lower down in the secondary school, English courses will have an aspect of media. So English teachers tend to teach about the media they feel most comfortable with. So they might teach about, the film of the book, but often they will teach about advertising. They'll teach about the press. They're very comfortable with print media, newspapers. But they might well also teach about soap operas, about popular cinema, sometimes about new media. That happens throughout the secondary school. In primary schools, much less, I would say. So sometimes you will have teachers doing very interesting work with media, but they're exceptions. There is no really very strong provision in the curriculum that means that primary school teachers must teach about media. Media also occurs in other curriculum areas. And I think one thing that will be a running theme in my talk is the relation between media and technology. I guess as in Germany, I'm sure, there's been a big push by governments, but also, not least, by commercial companies to put technology into schools. So in the UK, we have a compulsory curriculum subject, ICT, Information and Communication Technologies, which is taught right the way through school. I am, I should say, extremely critical of what is taught in this subject. I think what children are taught is basically how to use Microsoft Office. You know, they're taught about spreadsheets and file management and word processing, and, you know, they do PowerPoint presentations. It's a subject with no content, just very limited skills. And this is something I will come back to at the end. And I think one of the big challenges for media teachers at the current moment is how they engage with this push to insert technology into schools. How do we deal with and tackle technology in education? The other thing that I will also come back to, but I think interesting to note at the beginning, is that over the last 10 years, maybe more like 8 years, the government has become very interested in not so much media education, but what it calls media literacy. There was a new Communications Act in 2003 which established a new media regulator, a body called Ofcom, the Office of Communications. And Ofcom was given responsibility to promote media literacy. It wasn't really clear what media literacy was, and there was quite a struggle, really, to define what media literacy was. I think in some ways you could say that what was happening was that the government, this was under the Labour government, was really deregulating media. But what it was doing was passing responsibility to individual consumers. So rather than the state regulating the media, now individual consumers would be responsible for regulating their use of media. In some ways a very neoliberal strategy, we might say. But as part of that, people had to be informed consumers. They had to be media literate consumers. I'll come back to this issue of policy towards the end, I hope, if I don't talk too much. Because I think there are perhaps some interesting lessons. My sense is that this push towards media literacy is something that's happening internationally. And very interesting that media regulators are involved. It's not so much about education policy, it's about media policy, cultural policy. Okay, so that's a bit of the context that I'm speaking from. So what do we make of this brave new world of Media 2.0? What I'm going to talk about is a debate that's been going on in the UK for the last sort of 3 or 4 years or so. People arguing that in the age of social networking, in the age of online content sharing, in the age of virtual environments, and so on, in the age of these 2.0 media, we need a radical rethinking of what we're doing in education generally, but specifically also in how we teach about media. And the argument is that we need to change not just what we teach, but also how we teach. So it's not just about saying, well, we used to teach television and now we're going to teach the internet or computer game. The argument is also that we need to change how we teach. We need to change the pedagogy. So, the argument then that we need a new paradigm in media education. Let me just start by giving you a little sample of this debate. I think there have been a couple of people who've been important in this debate, and this is from one of them, a guy called William Merrin, who teaches at a university in Wales, but I wouldn't hold that against him. And this is just a little quotation. I don't know how far you can see this, but he's talking about really teachers needing to get up to speed with technology. He says teachers have a fear of technology. Our fear of technology often extends to our own personal use of it. Whereas in the broadcast era, we understood the basic technical principles of dominant media, we understood that use, sharing that use with our students. Today, lecturers, teachers are being left behind in their knowledge of what technologies are out there, their technical possibilities, how they even work, how to use them, what they're being used for. We no longer share a common culture with our students. Unless, he argues, we can keep up with these changing technologies and uses, unless they become as integral a part of our lives as they are to our students, we will lose both the ability and even the right to teach them. In an era in which we watched and studied TV, we had a right to teach. In the future, unless we're downloading, sharing, ripping, burning, messaging, networking, playing, building and producing, we'll lose that right. So there's a story being told here, which is that sometime back in the past, teachers and students shared a common culture. We all watched TV, and teachers therefore had a right to teach about TV. But in the age of Media 2.0, teachers desperately need to catch up with where their students are. And if they don't catch up, then they will lose the right to teach. Now, just a couple of questions. I mean, one is it really true that there was a common culture in the past? Is it really true that we've lost that common culture now? That shared experience? And secondly, I think, is this an accurate representation of what young people today are actually doing? Yes, on one level, young people are growing up in a world of new media. But in fact, if you look at the statistics, young people, certainly teenagers in the UK, spend much more time watching television than they spend on all of these other media put together. So there's a bit of a danger of a kind of brave new world futurism about this argument. But nevertheless, I think there is a challenge here, a challenge to teachers to think about how they teach in this new world. Okay. Another person that's been very dominant in this debate is a guy called David Gauntlet, who teaches at the University of Westminster. I think it's quite interesting that a lot of these people are actually talking about teaching in higher education. They're not talking about teaching in schools, particularly. Although in some ways you could say that these issues are more significant for people who teach in schools. David Gauntlet likes a polemic. He likes to make an argument, and he likes to make an argument often in very simplistic, binary terms. He makes an opposition between Media 1.0 and Media 2.0, so old media and new media. The old media were all about consumption, mass audiences. The new media are all about participation and production. Ordinary people have taken control of the means of production. The old media were hierarchical, top-down, one-to-many. The new media are a form of networked, popular democracy. And then he argues, well, actually, if the media are changing, media studies, media education needs to change as well. And here he makes a series of assertions about the changes that need to happen. He says that in the old days, with Media 1.0, we had a kind of canon of acceptable texts, of approved texts, whereas in the age of Media 2.0, we have the long tail. You're familiar with this idea, an enormous diversity of media. He puts in this polemic all sorts of things that I don't really think fit, but he makes an opposition between Western media, global or globalized media. In the old days, we used to teach textual analysis and political economy. Now we should be focusing on the audience. In the old days, we used to use conventional research methods talk. Now he's a big proponent of so-called creative methods, visual methods of research. In the old days, we used to rely on expert readings of media. Now we can say that everybody is making their own meanings. We need to look at what ordinary members of the audience are doing. In the old days, we needed to teach people, or we tried to teach people to be critical. In the new world, the world of Media 2.0, the argument is people are already critical. Now, there's a lot that's very irritating about this, or at least I find it very irritating. I think there's a way in which he polarizes things. He maps things onto each other in a way that doesn't quite fit. But nevertheless, I still think there is a challenge here. There is a challenge to think about how a changing media environment, and particularly changing media experiences of young people, might change, might need us, require us to change how we go about teaching. What David Gauntlet gives us is what I would call a kind of pedagogical populism. Yes? So it's very dismissive of a hierarchical focus on expertise, the expertise of the teacher. Instead, he argues that we need to trust the audience, we need to trust ordinary people. So he says media studies 1.0, old media studies, used to fetishize experts whose readings of popular culture are seen as more significant than those of other audience members. With corresponding faith, he says, in faux expert non-procedures like semiotics. You can see he likes to annoy people for the sake of it. In Media Studies 2.0, this is replaced with a focus on the everyday meanings produced by the diverse array of audience members. So audiences are active, diverse. We need to look at what audiences are doing. The patronising belief, he doesn't like people to be patronising. The patronising belief that students should be taught how to read the media is replaced by the recognition that media audiences in general are already extremely capable interpreters of media content with a critical eye and understanding of contemporary media, thanks in large part to the large amount of coverage of this in the popular media itself. So his argument is that in a way the media are already teaching us, audiences, everything we need to know. We're already critical. We're already sophisticated. We don't need to be taught how to read media. Now, I think, that leaves us, it certainly leaves me as an educator in a very strange position. If this is true, then am I out of a job? If it's true that actually my students are already critical, if they already know everything that they need to know, then what do I have to teach them? I think what we have here is a coming together of what some people have called the Californian ideology. Or perhaps I could say a certain kind of cyber-libertarianism. The idea that technology will create networks of knowledge that will somehow be liberating. That technology will automatically liberate people. And that is tied up with another, I would say, equally ideological argument, the argument of the digital generation. This idea that young people growing up today are vastly different as a result of their access to technology. So we have a notion of technology as liberating and a notion of young people as somehow very different, a technological generation gap, really, between older people and younger people. Both of them, I think, arguments that are characterized by a kind of technological determinism. Technology will have particular kinds of effects, irrespective of how technology is used, and also it will have implications, particularly in terms of historical change. That technology can produce generational change, generational differences. Okay, I want to question, first of all, the 2.0 argument. And I'm going to raise 7 questions about this idea of Media 2.0. I should say, these are intended as questions, but hopefully they'll at least get you thinking. What I want to do is not, I guess in English we would say, are you familiar with the word Luddite? During the Industrial Revolution, there was a group of working people called Luddites. They were led by a man called Ned Ludd. And they went around smashing machines. Right? It was a response of working people to the Industrial Revolution. And sometimes people who are critical of technology in the UK are called Luddites. Actually, the Luddites are very interesting, in fact. It's an interesting example of a social movement that comes about through response to technology, perhaps a more complicated social movement than people sometimes suggest. But nevertheless, I want to say I'm not a Luddite. I do not want to smash machines or smash technology, but I do think we need to be asking some critical questions about it. So my first question is, well, what's new here? Actually, if you look back to where this term, in fact originally Web 2.0 and then more recently Media 2.0, where does this term come from? Well, actually, it was coined by a man called Tim O'Reilly, who was, is an internet entrepreneur. And I think the role of businesses and entrepreneurs in all of this rhetoric is an important one. It's one I'll come back to. Tim O'Reilly coined this term, I think, around 2001. And it happened really at the end of the bursting of the dot-com bubble. You'll remember around the turn of the millennium, lots of new internet companies went bust, the market collapsed. And Tim O'Reilly, as an entrepreneur, was trying to basically rebrand the internet and save internet businesses. And this idea of Web 2.0 came about really from a business rhetoric more than anything else. But I think we can look back earlier than that, and we can find a series of claims being made over time about the liberating possibilities of technology. So you can look back to what people were saying about cable television in the 1970s, portable video in the 1980s. You can look back actually to the origins of the printing press. And what you find is a series of claims being made about the democratizing power of technology. All of these technologies would somehow bring power to the people. All of these technologies would somehow undermine the power of elites, would give ordinary people the opportunity to express themselves, to have their voices heard. This argument about the revolutionary democratizing potential of new media is something that goes back a very long way. And I think when we look at all of those media, what we find is that ultimately what happened was a bit more complicated. It wasn't simply a process of democratization or liberation at all. That's partly because technological innovations, as we know, are taken up in uneven and unequal ways. So my next question would be, well, who's participating in this world? And certainly I think what we find when we look at the research is that relatively few people are active participants in the world of Media 2.0. If you look at who uses YouTube, for example, actually less than 1% of people are actually uploading stuff to YouTube. And indeed, most of what they're uploading are clips from mainstream media content anyway. So a small proportion of users are actually out there in this space. A small proportion of users are actually actively creating content. And more to the point, when we look at the social composition of this group, what we find is that by and large it's the usual suspects. It's people who are already privileged in other areas of their life. There is a gender bias, but particularly a social class bias. By and large, the people who are out there actively uploading, actively participating in the world of blogs and user-generated content and so on, are by and large middle-class, wealthy people who have access to technology and certain kinds of technological opportunities. So what we're seeing, in a way, is a continuing digital divide. The divide, I think, now not so much about access to equipment, but access to opportunities for participation. Henry Jenkins, who I think you've got coming later in your series, talks about this as what he calls the participation gap. The gap between those who participate and those who, for various reasons, are not able to participate. So, what's new about it? Who's participating? What are they doing?